Christian capital is flowing into Bitcoin. There's a special connection between many religious people and Bitcoiners. And now we are seeing this connection not only on a surface level, but on a very deep level, so that those churches and non-profit organizations around religion and Christianity are discovering Bitcoin as a valuable store of value and a means of transaction. I loved this conversation with Jordan Bush, and it was very insightful to see how Christian capital is increasingly flowing into Bitcoin. Enjoy. Why are you excited about Bitcoin? What makes Bitcoin special for you specifically?
Yeah. But I, prior to getting into Bitcoin, was a pastor and missionary of a small church, helped plant a small church in Montevideo, Uruguay. And my family and I moved down there. We had 2 kids when we arrived. We had 2 more once we got there, and just helped start this little small church. And had about half of the members within the first couple of years ended up being Venezuelan immigrants. And so as knew nothing about economics or, monetary debasement or, any of that history or philosophy or anything, we were just trying to help people who were going through some of the worst situations, of their lives. And so it wasn't until about 4 years later that I got into Bitcoin, started trying to understand, what was the value proposition of Bitcoin beyond just the, get rich quick thing. And was stunned to find out that it was created to be a money that a government couldn't create more units of, unilaterally and with no work. And I just saw, holy cow! I mean, this is literally what would this Bitcoin, the way that it works, was designed to prevent the type of thing that happened to our Venezuelan brothers and sisters. And so I started. It took about a year. I went down the rabbit hole for about a year, not properly by myself, but I didn't know any Bitcoiners in real life or, even online. I didn't know very many people. I was listening to some podcasts, the early iteration of Preston Pish's podcast and Robert Breedlove's podcast. Was listening to some of those. And actually, crazily enough, the Lord works in mysterious ways. I was listening to somebody who was really influential on me, both on a macro front and early in their journey on the Bitcoin front, was Raoul Pal. Raoul Pal was starting to have conversations about Bitcoin and had some, some good people on. And so I just timed it perfectly to where, not for any, glory going to me, but like in terms of where he was not totally off the rails talking about, shitcoinery and, this is going to be risk-free yield on some of these things. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of my long and short story. I ended up just getting into it through online resources that had just become or were just becoming available in a way and to a degree that they really hadn't been at a more popular level. And so, yeah, so I think for me, the kind of where it started to click was seeing how it affected our Venezuelan brothers and sisters just practically that way. But then even as I went deeper down the rabbit hole, it was like philosophically and theologically thinking about how to think about money. And like, if we're going to sit here and say this is better money, the question that, we all have to answer implicitly or explicitly is, well, better by what standard? What is the measuring stick that I'm using to determine something as being better or worse? And so all of us have these type of standards. And that we, either unwittingly or wittingly through study and these kind of things, we have an understanding of. And so for me, I had Austrian economic sympathies due to being a supporter of Ron Paul in 2008 and things like that. But I was not some deep Austrian scholar, and definitely wasn't a cypherpunk or anything like that. I was not a programmer, not technical in that sense at all. So for me, it really was the more philosophical, trying to think about what is money and how do I think about money theologically. I was kind of having that just rabbit hole of a parallel rabbit hole as I was going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And the deeper that I went, the more the more amazed I was at some of the conclusions that I, ended up coming to as a result of a few different things going on. So yeah, that's a beginning summary of why I care about it. I can get into more detail if we want to, but.
Yeah, Raoul Pal is an interesting one because actually when I got orange pilled, he was also very influential. in my orange pilling. And it's hard because he's a very smart guy. He understands macro very good.
Yes.
He understands why Bitcoin itself is very important. But he just chose to go down a different lane with shit coins and all of that. And it's fine. You know, like I no longer, like if I see someone that has one big flaw, it's not that I have to not look at all the other things also bad. A stupid person can still say something very smart.
Yes.
And like I can still learn something from that. And just because he might be on a different trajectory in like one regard, I can maybe learn some, like even, I mean, he's a famous example, Peter Schiff. You can learn a lot from him in this, his thesis around fiat monetary system, around gold. I wouldn't trust him when it comes to Bitcoin because I think he has has more than most people. But that's kind of like how I look at it. So Ron Paul is great, especially on the macro thesis with like the business cycles and all of that stuff. That's really cool.
Yeah, one of the things that happens all the time, this happens, I mean, this especially happens in the circles that I'm most familiar with would be like theological circles. And so this same dynamic happens where your strength in one area can lead you to be overconfident and just assume that you understand things that aren't necessarily related. And so Raul's something like that. All of us have this, you know, for all of us, there's something like this. And so it's not some source of, you know, it ought not to be some source of pride where, you know, you're like, how could this idiot Raul Paul not understand? It's like, no, we all have blind spots, and so we can acknowledge those things while still recognizing that there's people who see other things, you know, very clearly and much clearer than we do, in some ways. But I think the one thing, I mean, I can kind of clarify a little bit. Like one of the things, as I mentioned, you know, the theological side of things. So as I'm going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I'm also still pastoring this small church. And so I'm doing sermon prep. So every week I'm spending anywhere, you know, 10, 15 hours just doing, you know, studying the Bible and reading and, you know, reading commentaries and trying to, you know, figure out how to communicate, you know, a 2,000-year-old book in terms that make sense to people who have very little, you know, biblical background. And so there's certain topics in the Bible or certain passages that are much easier to understand than others. And so, you know, as I'm doing, you know, as I'm in my free time studying Bitcoin and trying to understand it and reading a whole bunch, it just kind of bled over as I was doing sermon prep. And so one of the days that I was studying, I was reading in the book of Galatians, and the Apostle Paul, he's writing, and he's basically trying to help these churches in this area of Asia, you know, Galatia. He's basically trying to help them see that just like there is a relationship between the way that we live and the consequences that come of it. And so he calls this, and this principle is repeated all throughout the scriptures. It's called the principle of sowing and reaping. And so the Apostle Paul is talking about the fact that what you reap, you will sow. And so it's just like if you were to sow, you know, orange seeds in the ground, you're not going to get apple trees. This is just not how this works. And in the crazy way that it works is it's not just a one-to-one sowing and reaping. It's not like I plant one seed and then I get one apple. It's no, I get a tree that then produces a lifetime of apples. And so it's really this principle of sowing and exponential reaping. And so I started to try to think about like, okay, again, I'm trying to explain this to people who don't necessarily have a lot of, you know, biblical background or haven't thought about these things. So I said, well, what are some other examples of, you know, sowing and reaping? And so I started to think about, okay, you know, like there's an order. Basically, it's like logic itself is a form of sowing and reaping. Like actions have consequences. If I do this, then it will logically produce this outcome. And so that's an unavoidable thing. And then you can just talk. I mean, you can look at a whole host of them, but this principle is really built into the framework that the scriptures underline. You've got things like the Apostle Paul says that if one isn't, he's counseling this group of people, and he says, hey, if one isn't willing to work, then neither should he eat. So there were people who they believed that Jesus had died on the cross and rose from the dead and was going to come back and you know, reign on the earth. And so what they thought was, okay, well, if he's going to come back, well, then we should just hang out. Like we don't need to work hard. We don't need to actually provide for other people. And the Apostle Paul was like, you're completely misunderstanding this. No, you actually absolutely should work, and you should be working not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others around you. And so this is something he talked about. If you're not willing to work, then neither should you eat. And the logic there is that the point of food, and we don't think about this a lot, but the point of food is to give you energy to survive and to serve others. And if you're not willing to steward food for that reason, to serve, we would say God and others, well, then you shouldn't eat. Like that's the point. We should use things for the reason that they are given. And so this was just something that I thought over and over about. And there's 100 other examples we could give. But the thing that kind of impacted me as I was thinking about, a dozen examples, was that the monetary system that we have functionally denies this reality of sowing and reaping. The monetary system that we have basically says governments can reap where they haven't sown. They can print money out of thin air. Governments and central banks can print money out of thin air. And it just gives them the ability to take a certain action and avoid the consequences, or try to avoid the consequences that come with it. And so then you see the negative consequences. We can give 100 of them, just societally, socially, relationally, a whole host of ways. We see how this attempt to deny reality, deny sowing and reaping, just saying things like debt is just money we owe ourselves, or this kind of thing. This is insanity, and we can't avoid the fact that actions have consequences. And so as I started thinking about that, I started thinking about Bitcoin, and how Bitcoin, contrasted with the fiat system, is actually a monetary system that submits itself to this idea that actions have consequences, that they're like that in order to get money, you have to work on the front end. You can't promise to work. It's, Bitcoin is rooted in proof of work. You have to sacrifice time and resources on the front end in order to get Bitcoin. That's the only way to get it. And so this struck me as a system similar to gold and silver and other, everything else scarce that's ever served as money, as a far more sustainable monetary system that's rooted in reality in ways that the fiat system isn't. And so I hadn't heard anybody else articulate this. And so I was just kind of mulling this over in my head, and ended up getting connected with a group of people, long story short, including Jimmy Song and Robert Breedlove, a process that ended up in the writing of Thank God for Bitcoin. So that was kind of my introduction to thinking about these things and why I care about them, because they have very real consequences, both on normal people and how they live their lives, but also how we understand reality, which includes how we understand God and things related to the topic of God.
Yeah, it's also really interesting when we think about the current macro environment and how many people still think this will all be fine. Yeah. Now, I'm not at all someone that says like things will be bad.
Yeah.
But if you just put your money only in fiat money, it will be very hard for you to live a great life. Yeah. It will be very hard for you to reap your rewards.
Yeah.
Because someone else is taking them from you, literally. And so I'm just curious how you think about the current macro picture that we have with that analogy of God, how bad it is really currently.
Yeah, one of the things, obviously we could go 100 different directions here, but one of the things that I just think about is there's something that says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And so there's people who misquote that and they say money is the root of all kinds of evil. The problem is not money. The problem is not money itself. The problem is the love of money. And so there's people who, for love of money, and I would include central bankers and governments in this, for love of money and the power that money brings, it produces all kinds of misincentives. And so we see corporations that abuse their customers or take advantage of their customers and for their own benefit, their own short-term benefit. And then due to the injustice of our justice system, when they end up, let's say they make $100 million through this fraud, well, they end up having to pay, or $100 billion through this fraud, and then they have to pay a $4 billion fine. And I just look at that and I'm like, this doesn't take a bucket of brains to realize that this is still worth the effort. If you're making a 25x return relative to the to the cost of it. And so excuse me, this is something that this whole system is, more broadly, we're kind of seeing the dying fiat system all over the world. All these fiat currencies are in their last gasp. and they're trying to, you have governments and central banks that are trying to reckon with the consequences of the decisions that they've made without just fully embracing it, which would result in the system collapsing. And so this is where I do look at Bitcoin, and I am hopeful that, that governments and central banks can, on behalf of their people, receive some undeserved mercy, not for their own sake, like I said, but for the sake of their countries and their customers, by embracing Bitcoin at some point here, and finding that Bitcoin basically it can like right the ship in very real ways. So again, it's not some panacea. It's not going to be pretty. I still don't think it's going to be pretty, but I do think that it could be a lot worse if we didn't have something like Bitcoin, or even something like gold. Obviously, there's still downsides to gold, but it's certainly better than fiat. And as things get worse, again, this is what I was kind of getting at, is there's a lot of things that for most of human history have just been obvious. It was obvious that scarcity was an important characteristic of money. It just was obvious. Why would I want to trade my scarce time for money that isn't scarce at all? That doesn't make any sense. Similarly, another thing that's been obvious almost universally throughout human history is that like God exists. There's people who identified different things about him, what we know, or her, or whatever. But the fact that there was a deity who created everything that we see, like that was just something that was pretty obvious, pretty universally understood. And so this is why things that are as influential as money are, or as money is, they change and affect the way that we understand the world. They change and affect the way that we understand ourselves, what's important, the way that we ought to operate in the world. And so I'm really hopeful that as more and more people wake up to the reality of the importance of scarcity being an important core tenet of money, it's going to have lots of downstream effects that are going to be surprising. And the reason I have so much confidence in that is because I've seen that happen in the Bitcoin community. I've seen lots of Bitcoiners who are not sympathetic to religion, or have like some superficial connection to faith, or whatever, who, as they go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, there's a whole host of consequences on their health and how they think about a whole host of other things. But one of those things is faith and thinking about God. And so again, I think that I don't think all religions are created equal. I'm a Christian, and so I think there's good reasons to. It just opens up a whole another can of worms that we've in the name of progress and enlightenment we've kind of have pushed off. We haven't had those kind of tough religious philosophical questions that are hard and that have societal impacts. I think those discussions are all going to be coming back, and so I think things like truth are going to be more important than ever. And being trustworthy in our character is going to be a really important thing going forward for a whole host of reasons.
Isn't it funny how a new modern technology is bringing back traditional old values?
Yeah. This is what I say to people all the time, is like Bitcoin seems like this new thing, but it's really this ancient technology, money, that's just packaged in a digital form. Like that's novel. But we've had, in terms of like the core of what money is, and which is at the core of what Bitcoin is, it really is this ancient thing that's been understood and appreciated for thousands of years. And so I think that recovering our understanding of that is going to recover appreciation for the wisdom of the wisdom down through the ages in a whole host of other ways. In ways that, again, when we think that the tendency is for us to really is for modern people to assume that we are more enlightened than anyone who's ever lived, because our lives are technologically better, and because technology has afforded us certain privileges, like we can have food all year round, and we have a global economy that facilitates things like that. We can, because of those gifts, we can tend to think that and tend to assume that we also understand everything, and that we're in a better situation on all fronts than people have ever been. And I think that is, demonstrably not true. Again, money, when you have easy money, it's just easy to cover up and to be blind to the importance of other things. And so I think that, again, I just have seen it happen, and I'm if you made me bet my life on one thing, I'd be willing to bet it on that as people recognize the importance of scarcity, and they recognize how many things that we just take for granted as being normal and obvious as a result of central banking and endless money. I think that we're going to be surprised at some of the places that it takes us back to in good ways.
No matter if you already have self-custody or still have your Bitcoin on exchange, your generational wealth that you have in Bitcoin could be completely at risk. And that's why I highly recommend to you to give the Bitcoin Way a 30-minute free consultation call to check how secure your custody setup really is and what you can still improve. So head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin. Again, that's thebitcoinway.com/Robin, and get your free initial 30-minute call with the Bitcoin Way. I finally and officially mine Bitcoin. This is not just something to stack more Satoshis, but it's most importantly also to support the network. Individual miners are the ones that keep the Bitcoin network decentralized. And by the way, you get KYC free Bitcoin. That's why I use Simple Mining. I get an actual proper Bitcoin miner. They set it up for me. They repair it if it breaks down. And most importantly, they let me choose the pool and even connect my own full node. I'm completely sovereign and I'm completely in control, and I can sign up with Ocean, no account needed. I just give them a Bitcoin address and then there's mining going on. No KYC, nothing. So if you're ready to mine Bitcoin, go to simplemining.io, tell them you come from Robin, and let's mine Bitcoin together. Most of the world that we are currently living in was also brought by Fiat.
Yeah.
Maybe not because of Fiat, but this even though with Fiat. So it's like we got progress, and even though we had Fiat, so Fiat was not even able to push away some of the progress we made. But it brought a lot of bad things to society. It brought a lot of like gambling, pushing out people, the risk curve. It's a disease for society, and the harder inflation hits, the harder the disease is kind of hitting. It's if you can also have degrees of how bad of a cold you catch. Like you can catch a cold that's just like there for like half a day. You have a little bit of a runny nose. That's it. Next day you're fit again. You can catch a cold that literally kills you. And so we see in Argentina all the time, past, I don't know, 50, 60 years, they tried with a new currency, died. Tried with a new currency, died. Argentina is one of my favorite examples for that. Then we have more successful diseases that stick around for longer and don't kill the patient immediately, which is the US dollar. Maybe, I mean, the euro hasn't been that around for that long actually, but they're like more successful like diseases in our system that strike the balance between the inflationary, the monetary inflation and the actual inflation, like the rising of the prices, better, because technology also brings down the prices, so it's more controlled and people don't notice it that much. If your currency is being devalued by 100-200% a year, everyone will notice. If it's being devalued by 2-3-4%, not everyone will notice. And so it's not everyone won't notice, as long as a lot of people, as long as the debt is continuing to, as long as there's a lot of people using that currency, right? And so the thing that we're starting to see is, as this thing unwinds, as it always unwinds, is, you start to see, as long as the world is on one currency, then that currency is going to be very powerful, and they're going to be able to, the people who most benefit from that system are going to be able to benefit from it. But as the system starts to fragment, which is what we've seen with Russia and with China, as they stop buying US bonds and as they stop, denominating trade of oil and all this kind of stuff in dollars, the Ponzi scheme starts to come to an end. It starts to, the music stops, and the game of musical chairs isn't as fun as it used to be. And so, I think this is
this is one of these things where it was easy to justify, and like the Keynesian accounting of why we moved to central banking was, well, we were trying to calm. There was all these crises that were driven by gold as money and silver as money, and so we wanted to bring stability to the system, and just we can have look at how plentiful our crops are now. Look at how stable our food supply is. All these kind of things. It's easy to justify and to spread that narrative on the front end because you're like, look what we can do if we just have the ability to create money out of thin air. Look how good the world can be. We can fix all of our problems if we just did that. And it's just a very short-sighted way. It's like, yes, you can fix things in the short term, but what is the crash going to look like on the other side of that? When you have a government, again, like this is to look at this a different way, like every system has a god of the system. We're not used to thinking in these terms, but like every system, every economic system, every whatever, it's a family, whatever, there is like a head there's somebody at the head at the top of the system who is kind of responsible for the system and who functionally is looked to as the provider of the system. And so with fiat currency, that central power figure are these central banks and politicians who effectively are creating money out of thin air, which is a very godlike power. And so the problem is that you can get away with that in the beginning, but the more time that passes, the more it becomes clear that neither the central banks nor the politicians are very well equipped to be gods. They're not omniscient, which means they're not all knowing. They're not omnipotent. They're not all powerful. There are limits to these things that are revealed over time. And so, it can be justified in the front end of like, well, look, the end justifies the means. The end of having, whatever whatever kind of system or whatever kind of, great economy or great crops or whatever it is, we can justify, all right, if you just let us print money for this, then we can fix everything. That sounds good, but the ends actually don't justify the means, and they actually don't justify it doesn't reflect the reality that, hey, you can't get away with this forever. And the reality is that nobody so far has had the discipline to recognize when things are going too far and to stop them before they're going off the cliff. And so again, even though I think that Bitcoin is an interesting case, just because the incentives that are built into it are for, nations and central banks who see this day of reckoning coming for this existing system to hit the off ramp, hit the exit ramp, to go for plan B and adopt Bitcoin. So I don't know. I think the early adopters, you're going to see people who humble themselves, and nations who humble themselves and wake up to the end of the emperor's new clothes monetary systems, and who humble themselves, they're going to disproportionately benefit. And we've seen it with El Salvador. We're seeing it with more and more countries. So I just think there's a ton of spiritual metaphors and application that you could just talk about the situation that we're in through that lens. So
it's interesting because, as you mentioned it, even if we have the perfect person sitting at the central bank head,
yep,
there is always this button he can at any time press to make problems go away.
Yes.
And if you know anything about human nature, humans will press that button.
Yep.
Because he can go through a lot of stress, he can go through a lot of pain and pressure. He just presses the button and all of it goes away. And so humans will always press that button and it will never change. I mean, it kind of reminded me of that rat dopamine experiment.
Yeah.
They kind of got a rat into a cage and they were able to put some electric things in the brain, and like every time he pressed the button, he got like a dopamine kick. It just pressed the button till it died with food in the cage. And so that's a little bit the central bank. It has to press the button once, twice, 3 times, and then it keeps pressing it fast and faster, because once you press it once, you have to press it twice to get the same kick kind of last time. It's a little bit different, obviously, with central banks. It's just like the interest rate compounding, the debt compounding. So you need, each time you print, you need more money to pay for the debt, the new debt and the old debt. And so it's just a system that's just designed to fail at some point.
Yep.
And the people that save in that very currency are the ones that actually are suffering. It's a very sad system, actually, if you think about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And this is where this is why I think this is so important, is you have the contrasting systems. So I'll start with, a great place to start for any kind of trying to understand anything, Lord of the Rings. You look at Denethor, who was the steward of Gondor. And he basically was, obviously Aragorn's family had the right to be the kings. And then they had, he basically had rejected, the whole thing had gone down. He had rejected this role. He didn't want to assume it. And so he kind of went off and lived as a ranger. And so then the events of Lord of the Rings start to happen. And Gandalf comes to Denethor, who's the steward of Gondor. He's a placeholder for the day that the king returns. He's responsible for his people, but he's supposed to serve them. He's supposed to live and serve them. He ought to be the one to ride out and defend his people and fight. Instead of him going, he sends out his sons to go do this. And then one of them dies, the one that he loved more. And then Gandalf comes back to him and says, hey, the rightful king has returned. And he refuses to deny himself and to step down from this power that he had gotten drunk off of. He refused to give it to the guy, even when he recognized this is the rightful guy. Like the rightful guy, this guy actually bloodline, like, deserves to be the king. He's actually equipped to be the king. The whole thing. And so I think you can also look at this in terms of just the leadership of the fiat monetary system, where you have like the only way that governments and central banks, when they push that button, the only way that they can benefit and quote unquote save the system is by stealing purchasing power from every single other citizen. So of course, like they're incentivized to do this, to try to save the day, to try to fix the system, and yet the system it's just inherently broken. It is by pushing the button, you're actually hurting the people. It's implicit in the action itself. And so this is contrasted again, what Tolkien was getting at, and what was kind of driving him using that metaphor, is because this is the same understanding, and same way that the Christian gospel talks about Jesus. Jesus, he is the rightful king. He has every right to, come down and basically demand the world's allegiance and demand that they worship him because of who he is. And yet when he came, he didn't do that. He said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so Jesus, he lives his life as a servant. He basically serves other people. He heals them. He does all these things. And he ends up giving his life in order to rescue the world, in order to save the world. And so he takes his rights, he lays them down in order to do what is in the best interest of the people. And so I'm still hopeful, because I believe in that reality. I'm still hopeful that at some point we could have, how incredible would it be if you just have in our lifetimes the Federal Reserve bowing the knee and just basically acknowledging, hey, we are not equipped to deal with this anymore. We cannot maintain this authority. Or Trump or whatever future president or future leader of this ECB, whatever it is, just as these central banks just wake up and they say, hey, we are not equipped to continue to handle this. We don't have the information. We have to adapt the reign of another sovereign that is better equipped to bring about human flourishing in a way that this one no longer is. So there's tons of parallels and rabbit holes that we could go down on that front. But
I've zero hope for that.
I think it's going to be self-preservational. Again, just to be clear, like I think it'll be, hey, in the same way that El Salvador, boom, like El Salvador, they have already, even though he's a politician, even though they don't have a central bank, but like he's a politician who saw an opportunity to save his people, and he saw an opportunity and understood Bitcoin enough to do it. Again, I don't think it's necessarily going to be the big dogs first. I don't think that. But I think you're going to reach a tipping point. We're already seeing nations. We're already seeing not necessarily central banks, but larger banks adopting Bitcoin. And I don't think it necessarily from like the same thing that motivated, Jesus, like this. I don't necessarily see that, but I do think at the very least, you're going to see for self-preservational reasons, at some point, and probably sooner rather than later in smaller countries, you're going to see it happen.
Yeah, in countries like that, like it could definitely happen. It's just the question is the inside of the system has to kind of collapse.
Yep.
And so the central banks of that country has to be so weak that it has no impact anymore on the politics. And so then the politics can say, we get rid of you because it's clearly no longer working. But the inside of the system, so the central bank, if they have the option, they will stay in power the same way as they want to be in control. Like nobody wants to take that head off.
Yeah. And it's true. And at the same time, all it takes is one leader. So again, with Bukele, he's a presidential candidate and then a president who he decides to do it. He takes control. The similar analog on the United States front would be governors. You have governors who don't have total unilateral control at all, but like they have a large amount of power. And so these are things that can be done independent of the federal level. And this I just think that there's so much emphasis, at least in the United States, and I would imagine Europe as well, there's so much emphasis put on the national level that it's easy to underappreciate the power at the local levels and immediate local level, like your county or whatever the equivalent is in your country, or at a state level. And so I think there's still a lot that you can accomplish, because at the end of the day, you have to have enforcement. I mean, these obviously there can be consequences that the federal government can levy and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the people are going to do what the people are going to do. We've seen this with marijuana. Technically, it's still illegal in a whole host of, it's still a federal offense in the United States. I don't know what it's like in Europe. It still is federally on the books as illegal, and yet more and more states are doing it. And it just gets to the point where the incentives and the demand from the customers, who are the citizens, contrary to what a lot of governments might want us to think, we really do. The demand is going to drive a lot of things. And so, Bitcoin is unthinkable. It could never happen until it happens. And so we're seeing it already happen. A lot of these banks are taking positions. And so I just think as more and more of them take a position, the objections are going to have to change. And I just think it's going to be good for the long haul. It's not to say that there couldn't be awful things that happen in the short term. But I still think for the long term, the incentives are all in the right place.
How do you foresee nation states interacting with Bitcoin and the eventual downfall of central banks?
Yeah. I mean, it's hilarious me talking about this question, but like I will, because like I'm not some like expert on these things. I just think more on the local level. I think as stuff starts to fall apart, you're going to get strong men standing up, strong men, regardless of their gender necessarily. I think it ought to be strong men, but you're going to have people who step up and basically take responsibility for their families, for themselves, for their communities. That's going to be, the first thing that's going to be more important. You need multiple things to happen at once. It's not like, if we just have the government do everything, then it's going to fix everything. It's like, no, that wouldn't fix everything. That's part of the problem, is that there's so many people, because of the structure of the fiat system, that, there's one point of monetary creation, governments and central banks. That's where it comes. When you move into a world where Bitcoin is operating and anybody can mine Bitcoin, like that all of a sudden changes the point of monetary creation, which changes and decentralizes the power structure. And so I'm hopeful that as that happens, individuals and families are going to reassert a lot of it's going to take education. It's going to take a whole host of things. But I just think like waking up, people were not created to just be, slaves and dogs. We weren't created to do this, where we're totally dependent on, one, in terms of human authority, where we're totally dependent on one guy. This is just not the way things were designed to work. And so I think there's a lot of just surrendering of responsibilities and surrendering of, just like willingness to take responsibility for our lives, for things like our health and things like a whole host of other things. I just think as the money starts to change, it's going to have these knock-on effects that are going to result in taking more responsibility, in a recognition that, you know, governments and central banks aren't gods. They never were. They sold us this bill of goods that they could just magically print money and fix things, and that just really has never worked. And so I just think as the seeds and like the leaven of Bitcoin and the logic inherent in Bitcoin, as that kind of works itself through society, I think it's going to produce a lot more healthier outcomes. That again, it's going to produce different problems. Like obviously, you know, in a world where you have totally scarce money, you're going to need, you're not just going to be able to hit a button to produce, money to help in the event of a hurricane or something like that. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to go without? And the answer is no. All throughout human history, the way that you've dealt with things like droughts and famine and all this kind of stuff is by your community rallying together in an unpaid form. So like, rather than having the government drop $1 billion on a problem and say, now we're going to distribute this all, you have people showing up to work and not get paid. And you have people donating and giving out of the abundance of their own production to help their neighbors. And so this is how this has always worked. And to act like we were all just savages before 50 years ago or 60 years ago in the United States, where you had governments have the ability to just massively money print and do things. It's a lie. It's just out of touch with reality. And I think that, Bitcoin is going to be one of these things that kind of just reminds people that we don't need governments to do everything. Governments are good in a limited capacity, but they don't do well and were never intended to do everything for everyone. It's an unsustainable structure.
With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups, because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. Finally, we have BTC Prague back in 2026. And this year, I'm not only speaking on a panel, but I'm actually going to present an interesting new angle, a perspective, a Bitcoin thesis at BTC Prague this year for the first time ever. I've never done that on any other conference, so this will be a fun one. If you listen to this show on a regular basis, I would love to meet you in Prague this year. It's very high signal, no noise, and Prague is just a freaking amazing city with awesome drinks and a lot of good food. Use code ROBIN to get 10% off, and if you buy with Bitcoin, you get an additional 5% off your ticket price. I'll see you there in Prague. Make sure to come say hi. Do you think that a Bitcoin world makes people more virtuous or just less poor?
I don't. Okay, so I would say more. It will make them more virtuous in the sense that there will be a shorter or there'll be an understanding that the relationship between sowing and reaping is real. There's a shorter recognition. So like if you, like in the case of a storm, right? If you don't have the ability to just hit the money printer and create a gazillion units to solve every problem, it produces greater stewardship in the person. It requires you to be more careful with your usage of resources. We've seen all these kind of videos from California and from Minnesota in the United States of just these massive government fraud, where there's government contracts, there's people fraudulently saying they need this money, and yet they're still cashing these checks because the money's unlimited and they just can keep getting them. And so in a world where that disappears, it's obviously the temptation to steal is not going to disappear. I'm not under any kind of delusion or illusion that that's going to happen. But there will be a closer understanding of actions having consequences. I think that like we need to get more serious about things like that type of fraud, where the punishments will be stricter. I think whether it's severe jail time or, even death, like when you look at all throughout human history, one of the punishments for the common punishment for money printing was death. And I think that was wisdom. That was a recognition of the reality of the seriousness of what money printing does. I think that they had a better understanding throughout human history, and I think that we're going to recover that. And so once the risk of doing a type of fraud or doing a type of crime or doing a type of unrighteous or what was the word you used?
Virtuous.
Like when the consequences of undertaking unvirtuous action are high enough, you incentivize people to not do that action. And so, again, I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm not saying that Bitcoin by itself will do that, but it certainly will help reinforce a more ethical and moral way of operating in the world. That, again, a way of operating in the world that seeks to benefit others rather than prey upon others. This is necessary for society. It's necessary that we think of others other than ourselves. And Bitcoin does produce a structure that reinforces that type of thing.
That's a really interesting one. Yeah. I wondered that a lot because I see the Bitcoin community now, and I wonder if this is a window into the future world, or if it's just because we are early to the game, and people that are early to such a technology just think differently. Like we probably have more in common with the people that adopted the internet very early. That's why you see also so many AI debates in Bitcoin, because those are the same people that also try to figure out things early on, and they are early adopters. They are people that it doesn't have to be perfect, but the vision and the mission has to be clear. That's really interesting, because if you think about it, if this can kind of influence the whole Bitcoin sphere and it can kind of spread into society, I'm bullish on society, man.
Yeah. Well, here's something that again, everyone in all times has blind spots, and all societies have blind spots based on the way that they understand the world, based on the way that they understand the world to work. It helps them to see certain things, and it also creates blind spots. If you're looking at one thing, you can't look at you're not going to see other things as clearly. And so one of the things that I see and hear all over the place is a distrust of like moral arguments, or a distrust of like theological arguments or something along these lines. People are they get really uncomfortable when you're making moral arguments that are rooted in a belief in God. And yet when you look throughout human history, right, we like to believe that like reason is just this thing that you can have that's totally disconnected from any faith or any, anything. It's just this thing that's cold and separate from any other thing. And it's just like, no, that it doesn't work like that. And this is how like large scale social change, it happens. We see it over and over again. It happens through like faith-based means. So I'll give you a couple examples. One of the ones that I use all the time is you had like in the Reformation. So I'm a Protestant, so of course I'm going to go here. Protestant Reformation. What happened? You had a Catholic priest, Martin Luther, who was reading the scriptures and was reading and was able to read them, and he's coming across things that are in contrast with some of the ways that the Roman Catholic Church was operating. And so he got to the point where he just saw, man, these things are unjust. So for example, one of the things that Protestants hear all the time is, why are your church buildings so ugly? Why aren't your church buildings beautiful like some of these giant cathedrals in Europe? And, my little snide response is, well, because Protestants haven't been willing to, to the same degree, promise their congregants that, if you just give us more money, then we'll get your relatives out of purgatory earlier. And so there's things like this. A lot of the things, these beautiful cathedrals were built on, this type of, I would call it, money, this type of just taking of money and dishonestly earned money. And they were able to do lots of cool things with it. And so I think Martin Luther, he sees this going on. He objects to this. on moral grounds, on theological grounds. He says this is illicit. The scriptures prohibit this type of thing. This is abuse of authority. And so he proceeds to risk his life and go out and ends up getting chucked out of the Roman Catholic Church. He starts, he basically can't go back to that church. So he, again, continues worshiping the Lord. He does a whole bunch of things. And part of the consequence of this theological movement was this incredible humanistic movement. You see this economic explosion that happens in part because of this theological revolution that happened in Europe. So it's a theological, it's a moral objection that produces this incredible widespread human flourishing. Another example of this is in Great Britain. You have William Wilberforce, who was most famous for being one of the principal people who helped end the slave trade. Okay. Now, if you're just reasoning economically without any regard for morality, it was not in the interest of the British Empire to end slavery at this point. They were incredibly enriched through the slave trade by virtue of the power that it afforded them, the free labor. I mean, this was incredibly economically valuable. And yet Wilberforce, who was a Christian, came and pleaded with the people of England on the grounds that this was immoral, that enslaving people on the basis of their skin color and trying to defend that by saying these people were lesser than human, these are a subspecies of human, like that whole thing is a horrible offense to God and completely in opposition to what these people say they believed. And so he uses moral reasoning and theological reasoning, and the people end up over time, against all odds, people act against their economic interests, their immediate economic interests, end the slave trade without a shop, not properly without a shop being fired, but without there being need to go to war to anywhere the same degree that the United States did. So you see, what I'm, and then you could argue something similar with Martin Luther King Jr. Like what you see is Martin Luther King Jr. appealed to a largely Christian populace using Christian arguments and ended a moral situation, sub-legal structure that existed in the United States. So moral arguments, even though they are not comfortable for us now because they seem arbitrary and because there's so many people in the different nations that we live in that don't necessarily opt in and subscribe to these moral frameworks, we tend to be afraid of them or suspicious of them. And yet, in my opinion, we're seeing, by rejecting that, we are rejecting one of the most powerful, and I would argue the most powerful framework and rubric for change and social change that we can observe all through history. And so the way that this fleshes itself out through what we're doing is, with writing Thank God for Bitcoin, our argument is that it's not just less than ideal to have the fiat economic system. The way what we say is the way that the system operates is immoral. It facilitates theft from the most poor and weak members of society to the most powerful elements of society. This is not just less than ideal, it's immoral. And so this is very much fully throatedly a moral argument. And I think until we recover some of those, until we at a broad scale recover those, it's going to be very difficult to object meaningfully to things that the government does, or things that governments are doing, or things that central banks are doing, or a whole host of other social ills. It's going to be very difficult to object to them if we don't have some sort of objective standard by which to say this is wrong or this is harmful. And there's a whole host of things that we could look at, specific issues that we could look at. But I do think that, because that's true, and because we're starting to see people wake up to the importance of, moral reasoning and the role that money has in reinforcing this type of system, I'm optimistic that we're going to be, okay. We're going to make it.
I think so too. I have one more thing that I was wondering when I listened to you, because we talked about so many connections between Bitcoin, religion, God, and all of those things. Is there something in the Bitcoin community that you as a Christian feel like where you part with the crowd, where you feel like almost uncomfortable being associated with Bitcoin?
Yeah, and this is where following Jesus means that he's gonna. I mean, again, he was crucified, so like he was put to death. Like, you're like, oh, this guy was just walking around healing people. Like, what's there to? How could you not like that? And it's like, well, he also said some things that just weren't popular, and so there's there's things that Jesus says that are not popular in any world. So when Jesus, he basically says, hey, unless you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me, you can't be my disciple. You can't benefit it. So that's not a popular message, that you ought to lay down your life and form the purpose of your life, find the purpose of your life in Jesus. Like he embodied what it is to be human. He has a mission that he is doing, that he's carrying out. And so again, to say that he proclaims that he is the king of all the earth, he's the rightful ruler of everything. And so that, when we basically say, hey, the reason why we think it's important to have a monetary system that doesn't allow people, governments and central banks to have unlimited power at the top is because we think that this type of power ought to be reserved for God alone. And so obviously Bitcoiners will agree with that in the sense that they believe that Bitcoin is the best money and that everyone should use Bitcoin. But when you do get into having those conversations, and there's people who I love and, would talk with all day, but who would say, Bitcoin is itself is a reason, a reason to live, or it is, it's an end of itself. And, we don't need to talk about all these other secondary things, things that are more divisive, faith, all these stuff. Religion is just divisive. Politics is divisive. We shouldn't talk about these things. We should just try to put all of our focus on Bitcoin. Again, I just can't do that. There's a famous British author. His name is G.K. Chesterton. He wrote a book called Orthodoxy, is probably his most famous. He wrote a book called The Everlasting Man. He wrote a book called Heretics. He's just a very thoughtful guy. But one of the things he said is, I only discuss politics and religion. There's nothing else to discuss. And so what I would argue, and I think more and more Bitcoiners wake up to over time, they might disagree with this in the beginning, but I mean, money is political. Money is theological. Like you can't get away from it. What I just described for the last 20 minutes, this understanding of what money is, it corresponds with an understanding, a pre-existing understanding of what it means to be human, right? And so if humans are not designed to be, all-powerful creatures, but we are designed to be stewards, if we're not designed to be kings, but we're designed to be stewards of a reality that we receive and of resources that we receive but don't necessarily create, then that has other consequences as well. That as that logic fleshes itself out through society, we're going to find that there's other ways that us not being kings is something we ought to embrace. And it's also something that surprisingly and seemingly paradoxically brings us freedom. So like one of the problems right now that central banks and governments, they don't want to lay down, they don't want to embrace the idea that they are not all powerful. They can't do anything they want. That seems to be a limiting thing. And yet we see all throughout, I mean, our whole lives scream at us over and over every day that we find freedom by embracing the real limitations that we have. So if I were to try to say, you know what, I don't need to sleep anymore. I am the king of the world. I don't need to sleep anymore. I'm going to go crazy or die because I'm going to discover that there is a biological reality that I am bound to whether I want to or not, that says that I require sleep. Same thing with nutrition and food. If I say I'm just going to eat Skittles all day long and I'll be fine, I'm going to quickly find that my body disagrees with me because there is a pre-existing biological and nutritional reality that even if I reject, it still is binding upon me. And so I think that this understanding of freedom is something I think that is very important for people broadly, and especially within the Bitcoin world where there's tons of libertarians, there's tons of people who would, understand freedom as just getting to do whatever you want. And I would argue with a whole host of Christian thinkers throughout the ages that freedom is way more complicated than that. It's certainly important that, we're able to reason and think for ourselves and act in a way that, that it's important to have that type of freedom to a limited degree. And yet we ought to find and submit ourselves to real, strict restraints that correspond with our nature, that correspond with who we are, both physically, biologically, but also spiritually. And so again, the big controversy would just be, hey, Jesus is the king. He's the standard by which everyone will be measured. And yeah, if you don't acknowledge him, there's consequences. In the same way that, if you were to just ignore Bitcoin or deny Bitcoin, hey, you can do that. You're free to do that, but you're not free from the consequences of doing that. And so, yeah, so we would just basically say, hey, this Jesus, who is this king, who's presenting himself as the king of everything, what type of king is he? And how do we know? Well, he's a king who, again, laid down all of his rights and died for his people, suffered for them, was willing to lose everything to welcome his enemies in as part of his family. And so I just would say, hey, he's a trustworthy king, embrace him, and find in him something, a reality that is much more liberating than you could ever have imagined. So
it's a hard topic change, but how integrated is Bitcoin already in the church? Like, is that like a very small community that kind of got together, but like most people have no clue about it?
Yeah, I would say, if you're talking in the United States, then it's probably a bigger percentage of people than other countries, just by virtue of the fact that there's the highest percentage of Bitcoiners in the world, I think, are in the United States. So yeah, but at the same time, I would say, yeah, it still is a small percentage. So I work with Thank God for Bitcoin, TGFB Media. We do conferences and produce books like The Gospel According to Bitcoin, which is basically a Christian apologetic for using Bitcoin as a metaphor. Just basically, money is this thing that Jesus appeals to over and over again to communicate spiritual truth. And so we just basically do the same thing with Bitcoin, and there's all kinds of surprising things. So then we also have Thank God for Bitcoin, which is designed to help a larger Christian audience understand why Bitcoin matters in ways that aren't intuitive, making some of the arguments that we went throughout this episode. Just the morality, the moral dimension of money and ethical dimension of money. And so I think it still is a very small percentage. So I work with TGFB to try to create events and resources that can help speed up adoption in that sense. But the place that we've seen the largest amount of adoption and the most eager or an increasingly eager demand and need for Bitcoin and interest in understanding it and using it is in the Christian missionary world, the Christian overseas nonprofit world. Because there are organizations that obviously we just went through some of these things over the past couple of years where we saw these nonprofits that were receiving crazy amounts of money from the government and being horrible stewards of it being total scams and all kinds of stuff. But there are tons of Christian organizations that are doing incredible work all over the world that are, providing food and just doing lots of humanitarian stuff, and who are just having obvious net positive effect on peoples and countries all over the world. So there are organizations that are supporting that work, who are moving hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars annually all over the world, and for whom the fiat system is in many cases, in many countries, is still a very difficult system to use to move resources into those places. And so one of the things that we found is, especially in the last few years, an increasing appetite and an increasing desire and interest on the part of Christian organizations to understand Bitcoin and other things like stable coins in order to facilitate money movement around the world. And so actually I just about a month ago came on staff with a Christian organization called Brilliance Labs. We worked informally for the last few years, run by Oshawa Hawthorne. You can find him on Twitter at IAHSH. He's just a dear friend of mine. And so he basically runs this organization that works to be kind of a middle point, a mediating point between the Bitcoin world and the Christian church nonprofit world, to help both sides, to benefit both sides and get both sides of that equation, things that they need to, for their work. And so this is something that we just did this closed door event in Fort Worth before the BitBlock Boom conference. where we had, a number of organizations that were present, about 50 representatives from different organizations. There's a couple $1 billion worth of assets represented by these organizations, and all of them were there to learn about Bitcoin, both as a money movement tool and as a treasury asset. And so again, because why would these type of organizations be faster than the average Christian or faster than the average person to be interested in these things and care about these things? Well, because they operate in these countries around the world. They've been ministering and operating in countries that are experiencing hyperinflation, and countries where, they have war-torn things. There's, war-torn countries that are cut off from the SWIFT system. And so they need to find, in order to get resources in there, they need to find creative means of doing so. And so I've just been incredibly encouraged through seeing some of the appetite, especially in the last couple of years. And so, yeah, if that's something that interests you or interests your audience, we'd love to talk more and love to continue to be a resource to other organizations that are working in that. And so, again, yeah, there's a wide variety of types of organizations and stuff that they're doing. But we're, again, creating resources and doing consulting for those organizations to be able to, problem solve and just come up with new solutions if existing ones don't, or if there aren't, current solutions that exist. So,
I was wondering about that because I'm not a Bible expert, but as I understood it, it preaches honest weights and measures.
Yep.
And so I'm just wondering, how do they look at Fiat? Because if you understand Fiat and you are for honest weights and measures, you just have to look at Fiat as evil.
Yeah. And this is something that I was again encouraged to find even pre-Bitcoin. Like one of the books that we read that inspired us to write Thank God for Bitcoin was a book called Honest Money. It was written by a guy named Gary North, who was the economic advisor for Ron Paul during one of his presidential runs. Was a very influential figure in the Mises Institute, the Austrian economics world. Very well respected, and he was also a respected theologian. And so there were a lot of the churches that were connected to him they cared deeply about this issue on theological grounds. And so the churches that they were part of have been at the forefront of this issue for decades. And so again, they're still relative to the number of Christians, at least in the United States, it still was a relatively small number. But this has been an issue that Christians have cared about and been vocal about all throughout. Throughout at least the last 600 years. And then I'm actually working on trying to find out more information, going back even farther than that. But yeah, it is something that Christians care about. And the thing that I have found that helps Christians get to the point where they get the issue and they understand the problem is by just presenting the problem, is by specifically talking about the effect on just people around the world. When I tell people about when we were in Uruguay, half of our church members were Venezuelan immigrants. And then I discovered that same problem wasn't unique to them. This has happened over and over again to all kinds of countries. When people start to see, oh, wait, wow, okay, yeah, there are downstream consequences of this type thing that doesn't seem spiritual. This just seems like an economic policy or a government policy that is pretty amoral. But once you start seeing the consequences and talking about the reality of what's going on, people tend to care more than they would otherwise. So I think that people this is true of anybody, like anybody who has a strong moral sense of moral justice and who cares about these things, the more that you care about people and the more that you care about doing right by people, the more that you're gonna, once you understand the gravity of the problem, you're gonna wake up to it and want to do something about it in some capacity or care about it being solved. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic for that. We're kind of reaching a tipping point on an organization at the organizational level, as well as just individuals. A lot of the reasons why these organizations showed up to this closed door meeting that we did was because they had a normal Bitcoiner in their office who just was vocal enough and persistent enough to sit there and be the dripping faucet saying, hey, we should look at this. Hey, we should look at this. Hey, we should look at this. And so that would be my encouragement to all of your audience, in whatever capacity you're at, if you're at a normal business or if you're at a normal nonprofit or whatever it is, be the dripping faucet, and who's just there to try to encourage the leadership to consider these things, and because they are going to have outsized impact on the future of businesses, nonprofits, etc.
Yeah, it's like we all as Bitcoiners have our small part to play in orange building the world. It makes the whole process smoother, but it's hard. I get it. It's not an easy thing. We talk to a lot of people.
Yeah, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it, right? And that's the thing, is like, and there's a difference between just standing on a street corner and just talking about Bitcoin. Like that might be what some people do, and that can be beneficial to a degree. But there are. I mean, I have relationships where I just don't talk about Bitcoin anymore. Like I'm there. They know. Like I work in Bitcoin. They know. And I'll say little things here or there, but I'm not going full on rabid orange pilling with with certain people anymore. When I know that they're at a point where they're just kind of like, hey, yeah, we know, like we're like you just can't do it. At the same time, you can just be there, and there's people who are going to come back around and they'll be like, oh, I should have bought 10 years ago or 5 years ago when you told me. I get lots of those conversations. So yeah, you just can only do. You just be good. Again, the goal is what we talked about at the beginning. Just being a good steward of the resources and the truth that you have. And so, yeah, I just think that it's going to take time, but yeah, I think as things get worse on the fiat side of things and people wake up to the reality, as they continue to wake up, even if it's not Bitcoin as generational wealth producing, it's still going to be Bitcoin as, wealth preservation, relative to the different fiat currencies, especially around the world and in other countries. Obviously, it's going to happen in the United States at some point, but there's a whole host of other places where it's going to happen a lot quicker and in more severe fashion.
Absolutely. And never forget to love your neighbors and love your next ones, even though if they don't love Bitcoin. It's
100%. Yeah.
It's sometimes hard, but it's important. As you might know from the previous time you have been on, we have an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you the question, what will come first, Bitcoin mining in space or gold mining in space?
Ooh, oh man, now I want to know who this guest was. Man. I mean, the market cap is still so much bigger. I don't know, but then you're also looking at like gold mining and I mean, I would say Bitcoin. I'm going to say Bitcoin. I feel like how hard would it be to send up a rocket up into space and with some sort of or some satellite that like one satellite's mining Bitcoin? I feel like it's going to be mining Bitcoin mining in space. Calling it now.
Yeah, I think it's the more realistic one because people are actually working on that. I forgot which company it was. It was a big one, actually, a big company. But I read an article. I can't find it right now, but I read an article that they are actually wanting to put Bitcoin miners, I think on the moon it was. Was it on the moon? I think they want to put a Bitcoin miner on the moon, which would be so cool. Just like a Bitcoin miner on the moon.
Oh, that'd be so cool. Yeah, I haven't heard of that company who's trying to do that, but now I'm going to go research.
Yeah, I think I read it somewhere. I don't know, but I'll research, and if I find it, I'll put it in the show notes and send it to you. But Bitcoin mining is a whole nother interesting topic that I think we shouldn't open right now at the end of the podcast. But yeah, thank you so much, Jordan, for being on. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask your questions, reach out to you, and do all that fun stuff? Yeah,
you can find me. I got my handle right there below, so you can find me at Jordan Bush on Twitter. I've been like trying to get this handle for literally like 10 years. There was one guy who tweeted like one time from this handle in like 2009, and then it got put in like Twitter handle purgatory. He never used it again. I've been like trying to ask him. So finally, I just got it like 6 months ago. Unfortunately, I'm like perma endowed to Twitter. I have to pay Twitter premium for the rest of my life in order to keep this one. If I stop paying Twitter premium, I lose the handle. So well played, Elon. Please change that policy at some point. That would be, I'd appreciate it. But you can find me on Twitter over there. You can also find us. Our website is tgfb.com. You can find out more about our conferences and events. I'm actually updating the website today to account for the fact that our next conference is going to be in 2027 in Nashville, the day before the 2 days before the Bitcoin Magazine conference. We did an event in Nashville 2 years ago. It was by far our biggest event. We had about 300 people come, and so I'm optimistic we can get even more. And so yeah, it's a great event to just invite people to. If you have people who are tangentially related to the Christian world or even not, we've had tons of speakers who've been very generous with their time who aren't Christians who've come. So like Alex Gladstein came and spoke a couple years ago. I'm trying to think who else. I know there's Ben BTC Sessions. Ben came and spoke. So we try to do like a good mixture of people and topics. And so again, people who aren't Christians, we bring them in and to talk about the things that they're experts in. So obviously, Alex was talking about HRF and stuff that they're working on. Ben gave like a tutorial on Bitcoin wallets and stuff like that. So it's by no means some us for and no more thing, but we do target specific of the speakers and topics to try to make the best case for Bitcoin to a specifically Christian audience be in ways that we have found helpful and that we think will be helpful for them. Another thing that you can do that I mentioned, I've showed, you get the book over my left corner or left shoulder there, The Gospel According to Bitcoin. We've got the second edition of Thank God for Bitcoin, just published a couple months ago. It's been 5 years since we first published that book. Can't believe it's been that long. And then the thing that I am just most personally excited about, we published a kid's book. I think I gave you a copy of this in Vegas, but it's called The Orange Umbrella. Again, we just kind of were thinking, how can we create a book? It's a kid's book that it never mentions the word Bitcoin. You won't find Bitcoin in the book anywhere. So the goal was, hey, if we have brothers and sisters who we've already talked to about Bitcoin, they're tired of hearing about it. How can we do like a subtle roundabout way to continue orange pilling their kids? And so this just tells a story. It's like a Bitcoin parable, basically, about an island where it never rains, but where everyone carries a different type of umbrella that's based on what they think the greatest threat is related to a coming rainstorm. And then we're introduced to this shadowy or suspicious figure who comes along, who's talking about the value of his orange umbrella that everyone ought to have. And so it's a fun story. It's nominally for kids, and so kids will really enjoy it. The whole thing rhymes. I wrote almost all of the text, and then my buddy JD, who is actually the head of marketing for Ocean, he worked in Hollywood for most of his career, so he worked on the first 2 seasons of the show Rick and Morty, and has worked on a whole bunch of other things within the entertainment world. So go. You can pick up copies of all those books at store.tgfb.com and support TGFB in that way. And then the last way you can find me, like I said, in my new role at Brilliance Labs, you can go to brilliancelabs.org. I am the head of development and fundraising over there. So if you have basically people, either you are interested or you have other people who you think would be interested in, basically funding the orange pilling of Christian organizations or the Bitcoin pilling of Christian organizations around the world, we're kind of doing both of those things. So if that's something that you think is valuable, or if you have specific, organizations that are working in some of these places that you think could benefit from Bitcoin, like we would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me. Let's see, what email should I give to you? You can do J, I think it's j@brilliancelabs.org. You can find me over there. If not, just do social@tgfb.com. We can make sure we get you resources. So, but Robin, really appreciate you. Grateful for what you're doing in the space, the level of professionalism that you bring to podcasting. I just know I told a couple of our friends in the TGFB community that I was going to be recording with you, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I love his podcast. I was just listening to the other day." And so you have lots of appreciators.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's an unbelievable story. I think we talked about that before the podcast started. How you asked, I think what did you say, Claude? I don't remember which AI tool you mentioned. How tall I am, and I was like, wait, Claude knows that? Like, how can it know that? And it was actually accurate. And it's scary to be online and be known by so many people. But at the same time, I'm super grateful and thankful for for this huge gift that I kind of got from the Bitcoin community, just being able to speak with amazing Bitcoiners like yourself. So it's a weird world that we're living in. So it's a
very
cool
weird.
thing.
Very weird. It is, again, to your point, it is kind of scary, especially the stuff you see coming out of like some places like France. There's of public people getting targeted and stuff like that. So yeah, it is a little bit scary. And like I've like up in my OPSEC and a whole host of ways just to try to fend off that kind of thing. But yeah, but again, all that being said, grateful for you, and hopefully get to chat again with you soon in person, if not in online here.
Awesome. Then thank you so much, Jordan, for being on and being such a great guest today. Also, thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.